Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore the profound journeys that define us. Today's story is one of resilience, love, and finding light in the darkest of times. Follow Emily's transformative path as she navigates a devastating diagnosis, heartbreak, and the road to healing, discovering her true strength and purpose along the way. It's a tale that reminds us that even in the toughest storms, there's always hope and a chance for new beginnings. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. Let's start the story. The day I was diagnosed with leukemia, the world around me seemed to grind to a halt. The doctor's voice was calm, steady, but his words felt as though they were coming from a great distance, distorted and submerged, like hearing an echo underwater. I sat across from Dr. Collins, whose face bore that mask of professional compassion doctors wear when they deliver life-altering news. He told me the test results were conclusive. I had leukemia. Those words pierced through the fog in my mind like a bolt of lightning, sharp and undeniable. I remember staring at his lips as he spoke, as if focusing on them would somehow change the truth spilling out. My hands trembled in my lap, cold and clammy. I managed to nod, though my thoughts were anything but coherent. As I stumbled out of the examination room, clutching the thin folder of test results to my chest, I felt the weight of the diagnosis settle over me like a lead blanket. Somehow, I found my way to the car, sitting behind the wheel. My tears finally came, hot and unrelenting. I couldn't even bring myself to start the engine. All I could do was sit there and cry, my chest heaving with the weight of emotions I couldn't name. How could this be happening? I was 35 years old, with so much life ahead of me. I had a family who depended on me. The word leukemia echoed in my mind, a grim and unending refrain that seemed determined to drown me in fear and despair. It must have been hours before I pulled myself together enough to drive home. The entire way, my thoughts churned like a whirlpool. How would I tell Mark? What would Susan, my mother-in-law, say? And Sophie, my sweet 10-year-old Sophie, how could I possibly explain something like this to her? A part of me clung to the hope that my family, my rock, would offer the support I so desperately needed. Despite my anxiety, I convinced myself that I would find love and understanding in them. When I arrived home, I paused at the door, taking a deep breath to steady myself. I wiped my eyes, hoping to hide the evidence of my tears, and stepped inside. The sound of the television greeted me. Mark and Susan were sitting in the living room, engrossed in some show. As I stood in the doorway, they turned to look at me, their expressions mildly curious but otherwise unchanged. My voice trembled as I told them I needed to talk. Mark clicked off the television, and they both turned their attention to me. I sank into the sofa across from them, nervously twisting my hands in my lap. My heart pounded as I struggled to find the words. Finally, I blurted it out. I'd been to the doctor, and the test results confirmed I had leukemia. The silence that followed was deafening. I searched their faces, expecting shock, concern, or perhaps even tears. But what I saw instead froze me in place. Mark let out a short, dry laugh, a sound so out of place and cruel it felt like a slap across my face. He dismissed the diagnosis with a wave of his hand, suggesting it was probably just anemia. My protests were immediate. I explained that this was no exaggeration, that Dr. Collins had been very clear. But before I could finish, Susan's voice cut through the air like a knife. She accused me of being dramatic, of seeking attention. Her words stung more than I could have imagined. I stared at her, my mouth agape, unable to process how someone who had lived in my home, someone I had cared for like family, could be so cold. I looked to Mark for support, but his expression mirrored Susan's. His mocking tone returned as he sarcastically suggested I take an art class if I wanted attention so badly. Susan nodded, adding that I was too young to have leukemia, as though illness followed some strict age protocol. Her dismissive tone made me feel small and insignificant, as though my pain and fear were nothing more than a fleeting whim. Fresh tears welled up in my eyes, but this time they were born of anger and disappointment rather than sadness. I cried out, asking them how they could say such things, how they could think I would fabricate something so serious. But my words fell on deaf ears. Mark stood, shaking his head with that same mocking smile, and Susan sighed audibly, telling me to stop making mountains out of molehills. I felt something inside me break. Their laughter, their contempt, it was worse than the diagnosis itself. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stood and left the room, retreating to the safety of my bedroom. There, I collapsed onto the bed, my body racked with sobs. Every mocking word, every doubting look replayed in my mind, amplifying my pain and isolation. How could the people I loved most, the people I trusted to stand by me, turn their backs on me in my moment of greatest need? The weight of their betrayal was suffocating, and as the night wore on, I realized that I couldn't fight this battle surrounded by people who refused to believe in me. It was a painful revelation, but one that brought with it a strange clarity. If I was to survive, I would need to find strength within myself and seek support elsewhere. That glimmer of hope, faint though it was, gave me the courage to pick up my phone and call Rachel, the one person I knew would understand. As I waited for her to answer, tears streamed silently down my face. I whispered her name, barely able to choke out the words, "I need help." And in that moment, as her warm and concerned voice responded, I felt the faintest stirrings of hope. When Rachel answered the phone, her voice was groggy with sleep. It was late, but she didn't hesitate when I told her I needed help. "Emily, what's wrong?" she asked, her concern cutting through the fog of my despair like a lifeline. I took a deep breath, willing my voice to steady, and told her everything: the diagnosis, the disbelief, and the cold rejection from Mark and Susan. By the time I finished, I was crying again, my words choked and uneven. Rachel didn't interrupt. Not once. She let me pour out the anguish that had been building since the moment I walked out of Dr. Collins's office. When I finally stopped, spent and trembling, she spoke with a quiet certainty that steadied me. "You're not alone, Emily," she said. "Come to me. Stay here. We'll figure this out together." Her words were a balm to my shattered heart. She didn't question or doubt me. She simply believed me, something I hadn't realized how desperately I needed. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase, leaving behind the house that no longer felt like a home. I left a brief note on the kitchen counter, explaining that I needed time and space to process everything, though I doubted Mark or Susan would care. As I closed the front door behind me, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Rachel lived 2 hours away in a quiet suburb outside of Boston. The drive felt endless, the silence of the car broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle as I fought back tears. When I arrived, Rachel was waiting at the door, her arms open wide. The moment I stepped inside, she wrapped me in a tight hug, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt safe. That evening, over steaming mugs of chamomile tea, I recounted the events of the previous day in more detail. Rachel listened intently, her eyes filled with empathy and quiet anger on my behalf. "I can't believe they treated you like that," she said, shaking her head. "You deserve so much better, Emily." Her validation felt like a lifeline, pulling me from the depths of despair. For the first time since my diagnosis, I began to see a sliver of hope, a faint but steady light guiding me forward. Rachel encouraged me to take things one step at a time. She helped me schedule an appointment with an oncologist in her area and even offered to accompany me. In the days that followed, Rachel became my anchor. She reminded me to eat, made sure I rested, and sat with me through endless hours of silence when the weight of my emotions felt too heavy to bear. Her unwavering presence was a testament to the kind of friendship I had taken for granted in the past. As I began to regain my footing, Rachel suggested a fresh start. "Why not move somewhere new?" she said one afternoon. Her tone hopeful. "Someplace quiet, where you can focus on yourself and your recovery." At first, the idea seemed impossible. Uprooting my life felt like an insurmountable task. But the more I thought about it, the more it appealed to me. My old life had become a source of pain and betrayal. Perhaps it was time to let it go. Rachel helped me research small towns in New England, places with good medical facilities and a slower pace of life. Eventually, I found a quaint little town in Vermont that seemed perfect. It was nestled in the mountains, surrounded by lush greenery and peaceful trails. It felt like a place where I could heal, both physically and emotionally. Within a month, I had packed up my belongings and moved into a cozy apartment on the edge of town. Rachel drove up with me, helping me settle in before she returned to her own life. Saying goodbye was hard, but she promised to visit often and call regularly. As I stood in my new home, surrounded by boxes and the unfamiliar quiet of the town, I felt both fear and hope in equal measure. The first few weeks were challenging. I was still grappling with the reality of my diagnosis and the betrayal of my family. But the kindness of my new neighbors began to chip away at the walls I had built around myself. Sandra, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, brought me freshly baked muffins one morning and invited me over for tea. Her warmth and gentle humor reminded me of the goodness that still existed in the world. It was during one of my walks through the town that I saw a poster for a cancer support group at the local health center. My heart pounded as I read the details. Joining a group meant opening myself up, sharing my story with strangers, and facing my fears head-on. But deep down, I knew it was what I needed. I marked the date on my calendar and resolved to attend the next meeting. The night before the meeting, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I would find the support I so desperately craved. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew one thing: I couldn't do this alone. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes and let sleep take me, hoping that tomorrow would bring the start of something new. The day of the support group meeting arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. As I walked to the health center, my hands trembled, and my heart felt like it might beat its way out of my chest. A small voice in my mind kept telling me to turn around and go home. But I forced myself to keep moving. I reminded myself that I was here to heal, and healing couldn't happen in isolation. The meeting room was modest but welcoming. A circle of chairs filled the center, and a few people were already seated, speaking quietly to one another. I hesitated in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a space I wasn't sure I belonged in. A middle-aged woman with a bright smile and a colorful scarf tied around her head noticed me. She stood and walked over, introducing herself as Megan, the group's coordinator. Her warm handshake and kind eyes put me at ease almost instantly. "You're in the right place," she said softly, as though she could sense my hesitation. "We're glad you're here." I nodded, barely managing to mumble my name as I took a seat in the circle. The group consisted of about 10 people, each one bearing the marks of their own battles: thin frames, weary eyes, scarves covering bald heads. Yet despite the visible signs of struggle, there was a sense of camaraderie that filled the room, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. The meeting began with introductions. One by one, the members shared their stories: a father battling lymphoma, a young woman in remission from breast cancer, an elderly man undergoing treatment for multiple myeloma. When it was my turn, my voice wavered as I introduced myself. I told them about my leukemia diagnosis, the disbelief of my family, and my decision to start over in this town. The words tumbled out in a flood, and by the time I finished, tears streamed down my face. To my surprise, no one looked uncomfortable or awkward. Megan reached out and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "Thank you for sharing, Emily," she said. "You're not alone here." Those words struck a chord deep within me. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt truly seen and understood. Over the next 2 hours, I listened as the group shared stories of fear, resilience, and hope. There was something profoundly healing about being in a space where everyone understood the unique pain of a cancer diagnosis. When the meeting ended, I walked home with a lighter heart. I had found a community, a place where I didn't have to hide my pain or pretend to be strong. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life. The support group became a lifeline for me. Each week, I found myself looking forward to the meetings, to the shared laughter and tears, to the stories of small victories and hard-fought battles. Megan's leadership and empathy were a constant source of inspiration. She had been through her own cancer journey and had turned her pain into a mission to help others. It was during one of those meetings that an idea began to take root in my mind. Listening to the stories of my fellow group members, I realized how much strength could be drawn from shared experiences. I began to wonder if there was a way to amplify that strength, to create a space where cancer patients and their families could find not just support but practical resources and guidance. One evening, I stayed behind after a meeting to talk to Megan. "Have you ever thought about expanding what we do here?" I asked, my voice tentative. I mean, creating something bigger, an organization that could help even more people. Megan's eyes lit up, and a smile spread across her face. "That's a wonderful idea. Emily, what do you have in mind?" We sat together for hours that night, brainstorming and sketching out ideas on a notepad. I envisioned a non-profit organization that would provide emotional support, education, and resources for cancer patients and their families. Megan suggested calling it Beacon of Hope, a name that resonated deeply with me. It felt like a declaration, a promise to be the light for those navigating the darkest times of their lives. The planning process was both daunting and exhilarating. I poured my energy into it, finding purpose in the midst of uncertainty. Megan and I reached out to local businesses for funding, connected with healthcare professionals, and recruited volunteers from the support group. Every step felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was capable of making a difference. As the days turned into weeks, Beacon of Hope began to take shape. What had started as an idea in a small meeting room was growing into something real, something powerful. I felt a sense of pride and fulfillment I hadn't known in years. For the first time since my diagnosis, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, fueled by a newfound purpose and a community that believed in me. The day Mark called. I was in my office at Beacon of Hope, going over plans for an upcoming wellness workshop. My phone buzzed on the desk, and I nearly ignored it, assuming it was another routine inquiry. But when I glanced at the screen, my breath caught. It was a name I hadn't seen in 9 years, Mark. For a moment, I froze. My mind raced with questions. Why was he calling me after all this time? What could he possibly want? Against my better judgment, I picked up the phone. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emily," he said, his tone trembling and unsure. "It's me, Mark." The sound of his voice was like an unwelcome echo from a life I'd worked hard to leave behind. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, though my hands shook. There was a long pause on the other end before he spoke again. "I need your help," he said, his voice breaking. "Something terrible has happened." My instinct was to hang up, to protect myself from whatever pain or chaos he was about to bring into my life. But something in his voice stopped me. I took a deep breath and asked, "What's going on?" Mark explained that Susan was gravely ill. She had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and the doctors said she didn't have much time left. He went on to tell me about Sophie, now 19, and how she was struggling with depression and guilt. Apparently, Sophie had recently overdosed on pills and was now in treatment. The details spilled out in a torrent, each one more heartbreaking than the last. As I listened, a knot formed in my chest. The mention of Sophie's name brought back a flood of memories, her giggles, her tiny hands clutching mine, the way she'd once looked at me with wide, adoring eyes. The thought of her suffering, of feeling so lost that she'd try to end her life, was unbearable. But there was more. Mark confessed that Susan had started talking about me after her diagnosis, about how cruelly they had treated me when I needed them most. He said she believed her illness was karma, a punishment for her actions. Mark himself sounded like a broken man, filled with regret. "I know we don't deserve it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But please, Emily, they need you." I sat in silence, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to hang up, to tell him that his plea for help was too little, too late. But another part of me, the part that had built beacon of hope, couldn't ignore the pain in his voice or the weight of what he was asking. "Mark," I said finally, my voice soft but firm, "I need time to think." "Of course," he replied quickly, relief evident in his tone. "Take all the time you need. I'm grateful you didn't hang up." After the call ended, I sat at my desk, staring out the window. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating the papers scattered across my desk. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, compassion, and a deep, aching uncertainty. I couldn't deny that their situation moved me. I knew all too well the fear and despair that came with a terminal diagnosis. And Sophie, my sweet Sophie. I couldn't bear the thought of her going through this without someone to guide her. But how could I step back into their lives without reopening the wounds I had worked so hard to heal? That evening, I called Megan. She had become more than just a colleague, she was a trusted friend and confidant. I told her everything, from Mark's call to the flood of emotions it had unleashed. Megan listened patiently, as she always did. And when I finished, she asked a simple but profound question: "What does your heart tell you, Emily?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I sat with the question, letting it settle in my mind like a pebble sinking to the bottom of a pond. What did my heart tell me? It told me that this wasn't just about Mark or Susan or even Sophie. This was about me, about the person I had become and the values I stood for. By the time I hung up with Megan, I had made my decision. I would call Mark back and hear him out. I wouldn't make any promises, but I would listen. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even reconciliation, but it was a step toward something I hadn't dared to consider: closure. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt a mixture of fear and resolve. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't ignore this call from the past. Whether it led to healing or more heartache, I would face it head on, one step at a time. The following week, I boarded a plane to Boston to meet Mark and see the family I had left behind 9 years ago. The flight was short, but the emotions churning inside me made it feel endless. As I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur into patches of green and grey, I wondered what I would feel when I saw them again. Would I be consumed by anger? Would I crumble under the weight of old wounds? Or would I find the strength to remain steady, anchored by the person I had become? Mark was waiting for me at the arrival gate. Time had left its mark on him, his hair was streaked with grey, and there were deep lines around his eyes. But more than that, there was a heaviness in his posture, a quiet humility that I had never seen before. When our eyes met, he raised his hand in a hesitant wave, as if unsure whether I would acknowledge him. "Emily," he said softly as I approached. His voice lacked its old confidence, replaced instead by something gentler, more subdued. "Thank you for coming. I didn't come for you, Mark," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "I came for Susan. And for Sophie." He nodded, accepting my words without protest, and led me to the car. The drive to the hospital was quiet, punctuated only by Mark's occasional updates on Susan's condition. She was in hospice care now, her body weakened by the relentless progression of the cancer. As he spoke, I could hear the guilt in his voice, the regret that clung to every word. But I said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the task ahead. When we arrived at the hospital, my heart pounded as we approached Susan's room. I wasn't sure what to expect. The last time I had seen her, she had been cold and dismissive, her words cutting me to the core. But the woman lying in the hospital bed was a shadow of that person. Susan's face was pale and gaunt, her body frail and diminished. Her eyes fluttered open as we entered, and when she saw me, they filled with tears. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" "It's me," I said, stepping closer to her bedside. I couldn't ignore the flood of emotions that surged within me: anger, pity, and an unexpected wave of compassion. Susan reached out a trembling hand, and I took it hesitantly. Her grip was weak but insistent, as though she were clinging to me for something more than just comfort. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For not believing you. For how I treated you. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know, I regret it all." Her apology, though long overdue, struck a chord within me. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the deep remorse that had etched itself into her face. "Susan," I said softly, "I'm here now. That's all that matters." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Later that day, Mark drove me to the treatment center where Sophie was staying. My hands shook as I walked through the sterile halls, each step bringing me closer to the daughter I had been forced to leave behind. When I entered her room, I stopped in my tracks. Sophie had grown into a young woman, but her eyes were the same, big and expressive, now filled with confusion and pain. "Mom," she said tentatively, as though she wasn't sure if she could still call me that. I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. "It's me, sweetheart." She broke down then, her sobs racking her slender frame as she threw herself into my arms. I held her tightly, feeling the weight of her pain and my own blending into a single, uncontainable torrent. "I'm so sorry," she cried. "For everything I said. For everything I did. I didn't understand. And now, I don't know how to fix it." "Sure," I murmured, stroking her hair. "We'll figure it out. Together." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. I spent my days between the hospital and the treatment center, tending to Susan and helping Sophie navigate her recovery. There were moments of heartbreak, like when Susan whispered her final goodbyes, her frail hand clutching mine until the very end. But there were also moments of hope, like when Sophie laughed for the first time in what felt like years. The sound tentative but genuine. Mark and I worked together to support Sophie, and though our interactions were civil, they were tinged with the weight of our shared history. We didn't talk about the past much, it was too raw, too complex, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. He had hurt me deeply, but he was trying, in his own way, to make amends. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see glimmers of healing in our fractured family. Sophie decided to come back with me to Vermont, craving the fresh start I had found years earlier. Mark, though reluctant to let her go, understood her need for a change. "Take care of her," he said as we stood at the train station, his voice heavy with emotion. "I will," I promised. As the train pulled away, carrying Sophie and me toward a new chapter, I felt a mix of sorrow and hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, I believed it was one we could walk together. Sophie and I arrived in Vermont on a crisp autumn evening. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, a reminder of the season's inevitable change. As we stepped off the train and onto the quiet platform, Sophie clutched her bag tightly and glanced around nervously. "It's so quiet," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's different." "I know," I said gently, "but you'll grow to love it here." I could sense her hesitation, her fear of stepping into an unfamiliar world. But I also saw a flicker of something else: hope. She had been through so much in such a short span of time. And yet she had chosen to start over. That choice, brave and uncertain, filled me with a quiet pride. We settled into my cozy apartment. Its familiar warmth a stark contrast to the sterile halls of the treatment center Sophie had left behind. Sandra, my kind neighbor, was the first to welcome Sophie with a plate of homemade cookies and her characteristic warm smile. "This town has a way of healing people," she said, her voice gentle. "Give it time." Sophie nodded politely, though she still seemed unsure. Over the next few weeks, she began to adapt to the slower pace of life. I introduced her to my colleagues at Beacon of Hope, and she started attending support group meetings as a listener. At first, she stayed quiet, sitting at the back of the room with her arms folded protectively across her chest. But little by little, she began to open up. One evening, as we walked home together, Sophie turned to me with a hesitant smile. "You were right about the group," she said. "It's nice. Hearing their stories makes me feel less alone." I smiled, a wave of relief washing over me. "I'm glad. Sweetheart. Healing takes time, but you're on the right path." Over the months, Sophie began to thrive in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. She enrolled in an online psychology program, inspired by the work we did at Beacon of Hope. "I want to help people the way you do," she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, the sun setting behind the mountains. Her words brought tears to my eyes. "You've already helped me more than you know," I replied, pulling her into a hug. Our bond grew stronger with each passing day. We spent quiet evenings cooking dinner together, went on long walks through the woods, and talked about everything: her dreams, her fears, and the memories that still lingered from our old life. Each conversation felt like a small step toward the trust and connection we had both thought was lost forever. At Beacon of Hope, Sophie became an integral part of our team, helping with administrative tasks and eventually co-leading support group sessions. Her empathy and insight amazed me, and I often found myself marveling at her resilience. Watching her flourish was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, love, and determination. The organization itself began to evolve, inspired by my experiences with Mark, Susan, and Sophie. I introduced new programs focused on family reconciliation and emotional healing. The response was overwhelming. Patients and families alike shared stories of relationships mended, of forgiveness found in the unlikeliest places. One afternoon, as I prepared for a seminar at the local community center, Sophie walked into my office holding a framed photo. It was the picture of us from years ago, taken just before my diagnosis. "I thought you might want this here," she said, placing it on my desk. I stared at the photo for a long moment, the memories flooding back. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "Mom," Sophie said, her tone serious, "you've done so much for others. But I hope you know how much you've done for me. I'm proud to be your daughter." Her words were like a salve for wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. I stood and hugged her tightly, letting my tears fall freely. "I'm proud of you too, Sophie. More than you'll ever know." As the seasons changed and Sophie and I continued to build our new life together, I felt a profound sense of peace. Our journey hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of pain and uncertainty. But we had found each other again. And in that, there was strength. Standing on the edge of a familiar trail one evening, with Sophie by my side, I looked out at the valley bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Do you see it now?" I asked her. "See what?" she replied, tilting her head curiously. "The light," I said, smiling. "Even in the darkest storms, there's always light if you know where to look." She smiled back, her eyes bright with understanding. "And sometimes, you have to be the light." I nodded, tears filling my eyes. "Exactly." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. We stood there in silence, watching the world transform under the twilight sky. It wasn't the end of our story, but it was a beautiful new beginning. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting a warm glow across the valley, I realized how far I had come. Life had thrown its darkest storms my way, but from those storms, I found strength, purpose, and a bond with my daughter that was stronger than ever. Together, Sophie and I had rebuilt our lives, proving that even in the face of immense pain, hope and love could flourish. Every ending is a new beginning, and our story is far from over. It's a journey of healing, forgiveness, and finding light in the darkest of times. If our story has touched your heart, we invite you to join us for more inspiring tales of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for new videos that celebrate the beauty of life's challenges and triumphs. Thank you for being part of our journey.